ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the second series of Tigers and Teddies Live. It's so good to have everybody on board this morning, and I have to cross over straight away to the wonderful Dr. Suzanne Zeedyk. Suzanne, good morning to you.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Gary. It's amazing to be back, given that all of this was just invented with a second series, and we've done that because everyone was so keen to keep talking about these issues. And for me, it's exciting because I just get to have more guests, because I think these are really exciting issues.
And as promised, I didn't wear this in the last series, but it was sent to me by the lovely Lily, if you remember, in our last series. So Lily, I'm wearing this for you, kidda. I love it. It is the brightest bow tie I have in my collection. So thank you very much indeed for sending that. And of course, I'll just be very blatant and say, if anybody wants to send me bow ties and I'll wear them in your honor, please just keep them coming. DM me, I'll give you my address. Don't worry about it. So today it's really important actually today, Suzanne, for us, because, we're talking about something that's very, very close to your heart, and we'll come on to that in just a second. But there's a couple of other notable points about today. First of all, World Mental Health Day, which we probably need to acknowledge this more than ever. How do you think the world is coping? I mean, I know that certainly, as we're going through this new norm, I certainly have my up and down days. I know that you have your up and down days, and we talk about this all the time. But as a world, how do you think we're coping with everything? And how important is World Mental Health Day today?
Well, I think that what World Mental Health Day helps us to think about in COVID is that it stops us from othering people. In other words, mental health is not just about those people over there. It's often easy to create somehow another group of people. It's about all of us. All of us have been coping with new mental health issues because of the pressures on us from COVID. So I like that it feels like we are all more in this together, and it helps us to think about that.
And the other point about today, it is National Album Day. National Album Day. And my background is in radio for many years. Obviously, I'm a big fan of this. And I'm going to throw over very informally to our guests in just a second. And we have given a little bit of a pre-warning. But National Album Day, what's your favorite album, Suzanne, of all time?
I did not know that it was National Album Day until you said, but I have now brought my favorite recent album. This is Blue Rose Code's album that they just released during lockdown, with healings of the deepest kind. And actually, its theme is about aces, is about attachment. And so I have been playing this a lot through lockdown. Thank you, Ross Wilson, for bringing it to us.
I'm just going to go informally to our guests. Sally Amor. Hello, Sally. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Favorite album, please?
Well, I get flummoxed when I have to do an all-encompassing one. So my go-to album at the minute is Gaslighted by the Chicks, which is an anthem of middle years, perhaps, of grief, loss and rage and making sense of. So that will do me, and it seems to fit quite well with the theme of today as well.
And the Chicks, formerly known as the Dixie Chicks, I believe.
They were, yes. They've done their own reflections on trauma and loss at a societal level and removed the Dixie on the back of the Black Lives Matters movement.
And Simon Partridge. Simon, good morning.
Hey, Gary.
Favourite album, sir?
Yes, I had to sort of dredge up my memory, really. A very bad musical memory, but Bob Dylan came to mind, All Along the Watchtower, and that marvellous line, "Let's not talk falsely now. The hour is getting late."
I love it. I love it when a plan comes together. I'll come to you, Simon and Sally, in just a moment. But today, Zan, we've described this actually as a landmark topic for us: the overlapping history of attachment theory and adverse childhood experiences. Why do they matter so much? Why does this overlap matter so much? And why is the connection perhaps not being made as much as it could have been in the past, if that makes sense?
Gary, those are brilliant and important questions. Lots of the people who are joining us this morning, we have over 200 registered this morning from lots of places around the world, which gives us a sense that there's a lot of interest in adverse childhood experiences now for the last 20 years, which came to public attention in 1998 because of two doctors named Vincent Felitti and Robert Anda. Now, for many of the folks who are attending this morning, that will now be old news, and lots of you out there know that. But lots of people won't know that yet, and so that discussion is ever expanding. Why I think this morning is particularly exciting is that we have been having those discussions about how do you understand the importance of childhood? What are the long-lasting consequences? Why are teddy bears so important? Why is comfort and reassurance important, and what kind of biological impacts does a childhood in which you have comfort or in which you have fear, why does that matter? We have been having those conversations since at least the 1940s, but between the 40s and the 90s, it was typically called attachment. Came from a slightly different perspective. It came with different language, but it was the same questions. And indeed, you could say those questions go all the way back to Freud. The reason I'm excited about this morning is that it lets us make those historic links. And Simon in particular has been writing about those links. And Sally helps us to see their application in public health policy. And so this morning lets us see those links across time that we haven't always had a chance to talk about in the wider ACEs debate. So attachment and ACEs are not as different as sometimes people think they are.
Well, our guests this morning, and they're very, very welcome. Simon Partridge is a writer, has, as Suzanne said, a lot of knowledge on attachment, and we're going to question and certainly ask him lots of questions about his background and the work and the research that he's done. Boarding school survivor since the age of 6, which relates back to actually another episode that we had in our first series. And my favourite is expert by experience. Simon, good morning to you. Thank you for joining us. Whereabouts are you in the world?
I'm in East Finchley, London NQ, North London.
Wonderful. It's good to see you, and thank you for joining us. I'll come to you in just a
small
second.
hill.
Oh, lovely. So you can see everywhere, can you?
Yeah, basically.
Sally Amor. Good morning, Sally. Child Health Commissioner and Public Health Specialist, NHS Highland, co-author of the 2018 annual report on ACEs from NHS Highland. Sally, good morning to you. You're obviously a little bit further up north. Whereabouts are you?
So I'm about 14 miles outside of Inverness, up in Highland. It's
beautiful part
here
of the world
today. Sorry, Gary?
It's a beautiful part of the world.
It is, yes.
So we'll come to you in a second, Sally. Simon, if I may start with you, where did your interest around attachment come and start? Give us a little bit of background around that.
Yes, interesting question, Gary. Coming onto the show this morning made me sort of go back over my history, because one sort of, after a while, one takes these things for granted. You know, you arrive at a certain place and you're not quite sure what the journey was. So I go back to 2004, and I was getting very frustrated by the psychoanalysis I was in, which I'd been in for a few years, 4 times a week, I have to say. And about that time, my father's plane had been rescued, salvaged from a Norwegian lake 30 years previously. And the divers who salvaged the plane went back to Norway to celebrate the occasion and invited me and my sister along. And to do the sort of long story short, it put me back in touch with my dad's wartime experience. My analyst wasn't in the slightest bit interested. And I was really saying to her, look, at last I realized how I've inherited some of my dad's wartime PTSD. Interest zero, you know. And I thought, hang on a moment, you know, I've got to get out of it. So it was more complicated than that, but you know, it was a kind of a bit of a sort of watershed. And so I think that's when I first started looking around for kind of other explanations for my kind of sense of internal unease and disconnection. And I have to say, my wife was she unfortunately deceased, but she was a psychotherapist, rather Kleinian orientation. So I kind of went off in a different direction. I sort of discovered Bowlby. I discovered Judith Herman, because that linked in very clearly with my father's wartime stuff, and another writer called Sue Gerhardt, who wrote a lovely little book published in 2004 called Why Love Matters, which actually was the first, I think, exploration in our islands of the connection between attachment, neuroscience, and some of the dreadful consequences that can come about if that connection is not made, Suzanne. You know, so that's where it sort of starts, Gary.
Wow. So really your research and your work was born out of frustration, really, from maybe not being heard.
You know what? I mean, it's kind of strange, but I mean, a few years later, I kind of put the label of complex trauma on myself. But up until about 3 years ago, nobody understood what the term meant. You know, I was literally, I think people like myself, and I've met several since, you know, have been wandering around in a sort of fog of dissociation, fear, terror, you know, and nobody really, and then they're called sort of borderline personality or, you know, conduct. It's really quite recent we started to get a sort of handle on this. Now, in actual fact, there were people in the psychoanalytic world like Winnicott and Bowlby who would have sort of made more sense of it. I ended up actually knocking on the door of the Bowlby Centre. I mean, that's another kind of, and they were the first people to publish me. They published a piece of mine about my school experience, because that's the next thing I got into, you know. It started to make sense.
Sally, if I could come to you, does Simon's story sound familiar to somebody who works in the NHS?
I think it's familiar when we move into the territory of the things that he's been talking about around how we make sense of our lives and how systems can name things as one thing that take you on one journey when actually the meaning of that journey might be something quite different. And I think that's the real challenge for services. It's interesting to think about the journeys that bring us to these kind of discussions, really. I've reached an age that I never thought I would, which is odd, but prior to being where I am now, I did my general nursing, and then I went and did a human geography degree, and what I found there was it was a bit like why the world is in a mess without any answers. You know, why do people do the things they do to people in their families, in their streets, in their communities across the world? I then went on and did a master's in public health, and latterly, I suppose, came to some of the debates in Scotland around adverse childhood experiences. And for me, that was the explanation for why the world is in a mess, because it brings together competing different complementary strands of thinking and this eternal quest for meaning, if you like, which is way older, predates attachment, predates Freud even. You know, it's probably where religion comes from. And for me, we're born curious. You know, it's the unique capacity for curiosity within human beings that drives us. And actually our stories and the things that have happened to us are more important than we might be comfortable with accepting and understanding.
In terms of the report that you co-authored in 2018, we mentioned that in the intro. Were there any elements of the report that the NHS picked up on and adopted?
So the report was written as a summation, if you like, from a public health point of view, where adversity and or trauma or experiences take us. And I think, given some of the wider debates and the contention that sits around adverse childhood experiences, it's interesting in the introduction we say the team writing the report came to the considered view that we would not use the ACE acronym in the report. And this is intended to support a culture and practice of awareness in relation to adversity in childhood, something as adversity is something that can shape us, but does not define us, and we are all more than an ACE score. So we wrote a 70-page report without talking about scores at all. We talked about public health, we talked about risk, we talked about how the things that happen to us make other things more likely to happen. And if we're looking to intervene and offset that, then we have to be able to hold that space of the things that happen to us shape us. And that's not particular to Highland's public health team. Harvard have recently produced a really interesting animation around the biological influences on our lives. This is well evidenced, and part of that 70 pages, I think, goes into the reasons and the rationales for that.
It's interesting, isn't it, that the report was produced and the acronym wasn't used. But Simon, if we go back to adverse childhood experiences, you found out that John Bowlby actually used the phrase as early back in sort of early 80s, 81, published 82?
Yes, it was 81. I did, and I went and looked at some of my earlier writing last night, Gary, and found that I'd actually, I went on a course at Kids Company. I don't know if that's familiar to you, Suzanne, but Camilla Batman-Jelic, who in actual fact, you know, for all some of her faults, was a pioneer. And the course she ran, or her course leader Jo Cannell ran, was very much inspired by attachment theory. Is one of the reasons why I went on it. And I wrote an essay which was basically attachment, and then I start quoting the ACEs study, you know, and I thought, gosh, it wasn't at the end of 2018 that I found this out. It was quite a lot before that. And before that, I'd actually come across this fantastic book, which is in some ways the Bible, and drawn that to the attention of the Bowlby Centre and written a review of it. I hadn't quite made that final link until one sort of wet Sunday, I was rereading Bowlby. It was because of that, somebody on the Boarding School Survivors Facebook page, which I belong to, people there talk about attachment, but as you probably realise, Sally, it's not necessarily in terms of the sort of formal language. But you know that's what they're talking about. You know, I was sent away to school at 6, 7, 8, even 4 or 5 sometimes. I mean, it's extraordinary. And I was thinking, gosh, I think it might be helpful to explain this a bit more formally in attachment terms. But I don't want to go to volume 1 of Bowlby's sort of magazine, which is very interesting but not very accessible. And I remembered he'd written something in a secure base, and I was reading it. And as I got to the end of this article, the word adversity kept coming up. And then finally, this phrase leapt off the page to me: the consequences of adverse childhood experiences. You know, and it might just be worth my while quickly reading this out, Gary, because I thought, wow, but I didn't kind of quite realize I was ready for it, you know, because of the things I'd done before. It just it suddenly fell into place for me. I think that's probably shortly after I got in touch with Suzanne. I thought she'd understand. So Bowlby said, thus, adverse childhood experiences have effects of at least two kinds. First, they make the individual more vulnerable to later adverse experiences. Secondly, they make it more likely that he or she will meet further such experiences. Whereas the earlier experiences are likely to be wholly independent of the agency of the individual concerned, the latter ones are likely to be the consequences of his or her actions. Actions that spring from those disturbances of personality to which the earlier experiences have given rise. And I thought, in a way, Bowlby has actually gone to the essence of adverse childhood experiences and the kind of two-stage effects they have. Initially, sort of damaging the development of personalities or egos or whatever language you feel comfortable with, and then and this is very much, you know, it rang bells personally as well, because you know people who've been through this experience then find it difficult to function in the world and to relate to people, and creates a whole host of other experiences which are detrimental. It can become a very vicious circle. And when you look at the things which Felitti and Ander examined in their seminal study in 1998, in actual fact, the 10 things: emotional abuse, physical abuse, sex abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, mother violently, divorce or parental separation, criminal behaviour, incarceration. You could suddenly go, yeah, well, those are all in actual fact results of some sort of defect, some sort of attachment deficit. And it sort of suddenly kind of, the two things which have been rather separate in my mind suddenly came together. And it was a bit of a eureka moment for me. But I'd always kind of been puzzled because, in actual fact, Felitti, in the introduction to this great tome, talked about maternal deprivation, doesn't mention Bowlby. And for a bit, you know, how can you talk about maternal deprivation and not mention Bowlby? For an American, it's quite easy because, in actual fact, maternal deprivation tradition in America, this is an insight from Bowlby, comes from Renee Spitz, who Felitti actually mentions. Bowlby says at one point, he says, it's amazing somehow that American thinking and Brit thinking sort of advances in very similar areas, but on sort of on parallel lines which don't meet.
Okay, so what
in a way, I think, you know, in these islands, we need in actual fact to make our own connections.
Let me bring Suzanne in there. Suzanne, how important is this connection that Simon has made here?
I think this is really important, and it's why I'm so excited about today, and it's why I'm hoping that today's show, and I'm still laughing about the idea that we're now using the word show, but if that's what it's become, fantastic, because it means it reaches a wider audience, and I think we need to be talking about this. So if I just unpack a teeny bit of what Simon said there and why I think it's important, and it links to what Sally was saying earlier. We have, for 100 years or more, been trying to make sense of the impact of childhood experiences on your adulthood. So psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists have been trying to make sense of that scientifically, with theory, gathering data, trying to figure out how to measure it. And once they learn things, trying to figure out how to translate that to practice and policy and the public. So ACEs is the latest version of a discussion that we've been having for 100 years or more. Many people don't know that. And what Simon has just told us is that Felitti and Anda's use of the phrase adverse childhood experiences, which many people now know by its acronym ACEs, and which we put in capital letters. And some people are a little bit uncomfortable. How come it gets capital letters? How come it's this thing? Well, interestingly, Bowlby was using the same language, adverse childhood experiences, without a screening, without numbers, but with the same language 15 years beforehand. And so what that lets us start to ask is, how do we make sense of it? What models do we use of childhood experiences? What models do we use? How do we measure it? How do we assess it? What language do we use? Those are crucial, important questions that we've been having for 100 years or more. And what Simon helps us to see is direct links in that history. So there is debate about ACEs now. A big debate is screening. What Sally was just saying is that the debate about the screening is not the most important debate in her view. She thinks we need to be thinking about the phenomenon of early experiences in relationships that are not safe, that are a bit fractured. So the key thing I hope that people take out of this morning is that sense of history, and that these questions are much bigger. And I love that Simon has identified the use of language as a link. And lots of people don't know about that link because Simon's work isn't talked about more widely. Does that help, Gary?
Well, actually, I want to come to Sally with a question, if I may, doing the job that you do. So if Bowlby, which quite clearly was talking about this since 1981, published 1982, and the seminal work that Simon mentioned there from 1998. Why does the message of ACEs seem to be taking so long for the penny to drop? Why sometimes do we feel that we may be going over old ground? Are we making any progress with this?
It's a really good question. I don't think there are easy or simplistic answers. One is it normally seemingly takes 20 years to get research into practice. So you could say from that seminal study in 98, we're actually on track, because these debates started in Scotland 10 years ago. They do seem to prompt quite a lot of anxiety and or resistance. And I think that's understandable, because we operate still very much in a shame and blame culture, where the things that we struggle with, the shadow side, I suppose, I think that's a young type approach, is really prevalent, and we learn shame as babies, which is also really powerful. And shame is seen as a sort of is a feeling, isn't it? It's a manifestation. It probably means we're a bit stuck in a survival place. We're surviving rather than thriving. And actually, biologically, all we have to do as a species is survive. That the quality of our life doesn't matter. We just have to perpetuate the species at a very reductionist level. So if our only meaning is to survive, then it doesn't really matter about the quality of our life. The interesting bit, again, that some people talk about, is that we're born in process as humans. We're a bit like those bread rolls you buy in the supermarket that need another 10 minutes in the oven. You know, if human brains were to grow in utero to the size, we'd never be born. And actually being born as we are is quite a challenge, as many women will experience and profess. So I don't think that bit is understood, that actually when our babies are born, human babies are uniquely vulnerable. They just cannot survive at a nutritional level, at a physical level, at an emotional level. And actually we don't finish growing into ourselves until the age of 25. And our systems, our societies do not reflect that. And I think Pam Jarvis writes really well about that. She put an article in Yorkshire Bylines exactly around that. We commodify childhood, we turn people into things. And I suppose that's why I'll often ask in tweets, whose needs are we meeting? Because often in the minute we're meeting our own needs or society's needs rather than the needs of our children. So if we talk about where value lies, does it lie in the product of that child as a reflection of me, or does it lie in what I put into nurturing that child? And what do I bring to nurturing that child? You know, my parents were born between the First World War and the Second World War. My mum was packed off to boarding school at 8. She has a monkey toy that I've got a photo of her carrying. The monkey is in a box in a fossilized state, must be heading on for 90 years itself now. My dad was a refugee in the East End of London who came back from Wales to be with his mother. That their stories are very powerful. We haven't had a chance to explore them. My dad's now dead and my mum isn't really able to go back and look at that. But I know now that those experiences shaped them. They shaped their ability and the way they parented myself and my siblings. And that shaped the way I parented my children. So this is real for all of us. Some of these debates around ACEs in Scotland are, I say it's the glue in the room. We're all exploring a little bit what it was that happened to us. And if only half of us had a secure attachment, our experience conferred safety to us, then half of us are just that bit more vulnerable. And it is what it is. It's not a blame thing. It's not a shame thing. We are only at any point in our individual and societal development, but it's how we take the learning and move on through that is the game changer, really, to realize our potential to take us out of a state of surviving into a state of thriving when we're in our kind of prefrontal brain, which is the unique human attribute that we have.
Simon, if I could come to you and start to have a wee chat really around your early years experience in terms of being a boarding school survivor from the age of 6. Just give me a little bit about your background, your experience. You know, Sally talked about, you know, shame and those sort of feelings that we can get from being really young. So when did the penny drop for you, and what were your experiences?
Gary, before they do that, can I just go back and pick up something which Sally said?
Sure.
Because I don't want to sort of lose it in the flow. You see, I think the thing about ACEs for me, which is so brilliant, is it was packaged by Felicity and Ander and then Jane Stevens at ACEs Connections in a very accessible way, and it really burst out of the consulting room. But in actual fact, the question Sally raised about where we come from and how we develop, you know, I mean, there's a wealth of experience in people like Winnicott and Bowlby going back to the 30s, actually. And you can go back to Freud if you want to, and other people. So I just wanted, and I think we're missing something because we haven't made the connection. There's a whole body of knowledge there we could draw on very, very profitably, rather than reinvent the wheel. Anyway, I just wanted to say that before it got lost or slipped out of my own mind. My own background, well, it's, yes. Look, I think, you know, whatever the shortcomings of the psychoanalysis I had, and it was very impervious to some of my more external traumas, I think, it did at least sort of give me a kind of some sort of reflective capacity. And N2 is not too far from NW3, which in a way is with Freud once he came to London and the psychoanalytic movement. I mean, I've grown up in a part of London. My wife was a psychotherapist, so there's been that kind of atmosphere around me, which was both helpful and unhelpful, because it was so internally focused, and so sort of tied into drives and inner objects, whatever they are, you know, etc. You know, I think one of the reasons why Bowlby comes from a rather similar background to me, not identical, he's a generation apart for start, but Bowlby went to boarding school. Bowlby had very little contact with his birth mother. Bowlby was saved by his nursemaid Minnie, really, who was, as far as I can make out, not much known about her, was a very warm working class nursemaid. You know, Bowlby's ideal mother isn't born from his middle class, upper middle class background. It's drawn from a completely different section of society and relationships. Now, I knew at some level I'd been in a total institution from the age of 6 to 11. You know, nobody was going to come along and tell me, look, all your problems are Oedipal problems, Simon. They just weren't, you know. It just didn't really fit in. But I think the difficult thing was, you know, if you come from the background I come from, you are, in quotes, privileged. So it's in some ways very difficult to then recognize the disruptions and the neglect, and quite often the actual abuse in institutions. And I was abused by the school doctor at my prep school, I think in an opportunistic way. So, you know, it's very difficult to approach and bring out into the open. And I think what we've seen, and the other common factor actually between, in the little piece I wrote, Suzanne, when I made this connection explicit in the attachment journal, was the thing that set Politi, and bless him for this, off on his inquiry, was he made this link between the tendency to obesity and sexual abuse. Bowlby, in his later years, regretted very much that the sort of psychoanalytic world he'd come out of, because Freud actually refuted the seduction theory, which was where he started from, actually ignored, and because it had become so powerful in terms of psychotherapy culture, the whole issue of sexual abuse was in a way pushed into the background and explained through childish fantasy. That was a terrible mistake, and Bowlby said this, we made a very, very serious error there. So it kind of, it gave me an insight into my own early, not material deprivation, because that wasn't an issue, but my own early emotional deprivation. And just the sheer loneliness. I mean, I still, this is still kind of painful for me to think about, you know, sending a kid of 7 off to a school and not seeing them for 3 weeks, not being able, there were no emails, there was no mobile phones, you know, it was terrible. And you know what, in a way, made it worse was my recognition that my dad, who didn't go to prep school, primary boarding school like me, he'd been a prisoner of war in Germany, in Poland for 5 years. And he wrote a little memoir about it. He drew some comparisons with boarding school. I think a bit of him actually almost knew he was sending me off to a prison camp, you know, so he couldn't really deal with it. I mean, you know, it's again the sort of, Sally, in a way, the kind of intergenerational experiences which are so difficult to get hold of and work through. So yes, I don't know if I answered your question, but
you have.
That's the kind of, you know, it was some of those things suddenly started to make sense, and I had to face up to a lot of anger, a lot of rage at the abandonment and the neglect, you know.
Can I come in there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, by the way, Simon. That was more than an answer. Thank you so much, Suzanne.
Simon, that was very powerful, and I'm watching the chat come in, and your personal story helps people to get the bigger picture. And I think that is one of the powerful elements of the ACEs movement, is that there are so many voices of lived experience where people are telling their stories, the personal stories of pain and trauma and childhood suffering.
Yeah.
I know that Elizabeth Perry is here with us from Canada at the moment today. It's still dark there. Elizabeth had to get up early. Okay, so Elizabeth is a key voice, is the lead voice in Canada, and she speaks from lived experience. So good morning.
Hello, Elizabeth.
And can I also say, as long as I'm talking international links, this is the mug from Netherlands. So this was a gift to me from Marianne, who's trying to help, and Vic, who are trying to help the Netherlands to understand the ACEs. Okay, let me go back to the things that Simon has said and that I said just a few minutes ago. How do we make sense of the impact of our childhoods on our adulthoods? How do we do that? ACEs is trying to explore that. Bowlby was trying to explore that. Freud was trying to explore that, and a whole lot of other people in the mix. These are hard questions. These are scary. It makes us confront feelings from when we were babies, and we're often overwhelmed. And Sally said earlier, you can experience shame in the first months of life when you can't make sense of any of that. And what we know across all of those years of research is that relationships shape us biologically, physiologically, and the emotions get embedded in the body. What has been more difficult is for people to find ways to be able to face up to that. Because, in fact, Simon might hold up his book in a minute about 50 years of attachment research. I know it's sitting there next to you, Simon. You held it up a minute ago before we came on air. That is, so Simon's book, which was written by Richard Bowlby, the son of John Bowlby, explores why do people have trouble facing up to what attachment science tells us. It's the same question, why do we have trouble facing up to what ACEs is telling us? These are hard questions. They make us go back into our childhood of really uncomfortable feelings, especially if you had a childhood of trauma. But they also make adults look at how they're caring for children. So if Simon's father really understood what Simon was just saying, it might make him feel conflicted or ashamed of his parenting. And so we shut that down. Simon's father will have done his best by Simon. But when you discover that you caused pain that you never meant to, and that you were just doing what was ordinary and normal, like sending your children to boarding school, or telling your child to be quiet, or smacking your child, or not giving them a whole lot of attention because you're distracted by social media, or because you're stressed, because you live in poverty and adversity. All of those issues shape the way we parent. And the idea that our parenting should have had an impact on our children much earlier than we realized is hard for parents to look at. And it's also hard for professionals. So when you discover that as a social worker, you made decisions for a child that probably had a long-term impact that you didn't realize, that's hard to look at professionally. Early years. So I'm trying to give a really fast, overarching, broad view of why it is hard for us to look at the insights that ACEs and attachment and psychoanalytic theory gives us. And I think the debate around ACEs picks up on that difficulty that has been around for decades now. Here's the bottom line. If we cannot do that, we continue to damage children. If we cannot do that, we continue to prevent people from healing when they're adults. And I think people have a right to this information so that we have a chance of helping people to heal, so that we stop creating that kind of adversity. We could stop this, or a lot of it. We could reduce it if we could get brave enough to look at the things that make us uncomfortable, which is why I'm delighted with everybody who's here this morning and everybody who's part of this debate that lets us look at the impacts of childhood suffering. And I think we all deserve that.
If we look at people who have a counter view on ACEs, Suzanne, what are the big concerns that you hear? I mean, you're stimulating debate. That's what this program, what this series is about. It's to keep this debate in the public eye, and actually to make the communication as around ACEs as simple and as straightforward and as understandable as possible. But what do you feel the concerns are for people who have an opposite view?
It's a great question. And in just a second, I would love to know what Sally and Simon also think. One of the key issues that people in the ACEs conversations are worried about is screening. And I think that's important. That's a big issue. So in other words, how do you make sense of, how do you measure the impact of childhood experiences? Well, different people over time have had different views about that. At the moment, the ACEs screening is one way that some people are doing that. Other people are worried about power in that. So they are worried that that screening device will be used by organizations, systems, in a way that is not trauma-informed, and a way that reconnects to the trauma, that makes it worse. Those are important conversations to have. Power gets mixed into any way of using this science. We need to have those discussions. We also need to pay attention to the ways in which ACEs science has been helpful and useful to many people. We need to have both sides of that conversation. And sometimes the tone of the debate has got really angry and accusatory and blaming, and that shuts down people from being able to be curious. And I personally think that curiosity is crucial to making sense of how we provide the best environments in which to raise children and for people to heal.
Sally, I think it's a really good point for you to come in here. So really, it is the same question. Why do you think people who are on the opposite side of the debate, why are they so anxious about this? And actually, how do you counter it?
So I think one of the challenges we have in the debates around ACEs and screening and scoring is a few things. One is the translation of what happens to me at an individual to what happens to us at a population level, particularly when these scenarios are so very personal and so almost inherently shaming. You know, that they're difficult for those of us who've been at the receiving end of a less than ideal parenting experience. They're difficult for parents who might now realize or might not be able to realise they themselves have been party to this complex knot of humanness which is still working its way through. That there is something that says we have to recognise we are where we are with this, but there are things that we can do. I think from a public health point of view, which is interested in population health and well-being, what we can say with quite a lot of confidence at the higher end of the implications of multiple experience adversities, when we look at violence, which we know is a global issue, a family issue, a personal issue, when we look at suicides, and when we look at drug misuse, substance misuse, that those are things that play out in many people's lives on a day-to-day basis, and the consequences of those things play out at the really sharp end, and that they become caught up in the weft and warp of our lives in many ways. Screening in public health terms is a very particular thing, and I don't think we have I don't think we can say that screening per se is something that we can respond to meet that public health criteria for screening. But I do know that the work they're doing, for example, in California with Nadine Burke has actually had a huge amount of thought and care applied to it. Nobody is going out vicariously to count rubbish things that have happened to people, to rub their noses in it and to make some scientific point. You know, if you read The Deepest Well, if you read some of the more recent stuff I think that's come out through ACEs Connection, what they're trying to do is find the evidence along the way. They've developed those approaches to population screening they've co-produced it with people who use their services. All her work at the Center for Wellness in San Francisco was created with a dialogue with families and with young people, so was actually quite discerning. So I think when we criticize from outside rather than from within, we leave ourselves vulnerable to being asked, what is that anger about? When people get caught up, you know, that there seems to be a view that some people who've had experiences of adversity find it very helpful, others don't find it helpful. So what is our role as leaders, as professionals, as thought leaders, whatever we're calling it, to keep people safe? Because if people are saying that wasn't good for me, then clearly we need to pay attention to that. But how do we meet that need if it wasn't being good for me? Do we meet that need by providing reassurance, or do we meet that need by playing that anger and that distress out publicly? I think we come with huge responsibilities to people when we talk about these things, and having an angry discourse on Twitter nobody's winning from that. It's back to whose needs are we meeting here? My need to be validated in the knowledge I have, or the needs of the people who are affected by what I'm doing.
Yeah. So, Simon, if I could come to you, thank you, Sally, for that answer. It seems that part of the issue about where we become uncomfortable with ACEs is because we're almost putting a mirror up to ourselves. So whether that's us thinking about our childhood, our background, or we're thinking about our parenting skills, which obviously none of us would want to be criticised for. Is that part of the difficulty? Is it actually that? Because you've quite clearly, from the answers you've given us this morning, have put a mirror up to yourself and have certainly studied and really been very in depth with where you're coming from. Is that part of the problem? Are we having difficulty in looking in that mirror and addressing these issues?
Well, I come at this from a more sort of survivor perspective, Gary, in a way, I think that one of the things where I found, and other survivors I'm in touch with and talk to, found the ACEs approach very helpful, is that it's not just professional. And I know that there are criticisms of the ACE score. In actual fact, a lot of survivors find it quite helpful because it can be self-administered. It's actually much simpler than the previous strange situation test or the adult attachment interview. Now, when this gets into the hands of professionals, of course, there are issues of how you measure it, how you diagnose, how you help. But there's always been a very strong community base to the ACEs movement, and that's in a way one of the innovations. I think that was a major innovation, and I think we have to credit Flitti and Anda. They were always very community oriented. of course, the other great link they made was that, in actual fact, to physical illness, which had got rather ignored in the psychoanalytic tradition, which was focused on the mind. I think, you know, that people who've been in a and I'm talking about real adversity here, Gary. The other thing I think is important to say is that there is an important recognition within the original ACE study of what they call the dose response. It's not people who've had maybe 1 or 2 bad experiences over a short period of time. Most people have the resilience probably to cope with that, and have parents who can actually recognize, yeah, I did something pretty bad there, that it can be repaired. It's more people who've actually been grossly abused or neglected over a great length of time. And the ACE score, which signals danger, is 4+, you know. So I think that is a distinction which isn't made enough. We're talking about, you know, probably 10, 15% of people who've really had a pretty bad time. So that's an important thing. But I think that sort of the people I've met through complex trauma support groups, through the boarding school survivors movement, you know, we've been to, well, you know, we've been down there. It's very, very unpleasant. And in actual fact, you want to try and sort something out. And I think, in a way, what ACEs has done for me has turned my rather more academic and sort of intellectual knowledge of attachment into something which is much more accessible. And I say hooray, you know, great, it's actually getting out there. Okay, there are issues we have to address, there are problems we have to face, we need some resources, but I think this whole emphasis on trauma-informed care is a fantastic step forward, you know. Now it's going to challenge a lot of people. It's not going to be an easy journey, but it really is, I think, a kind of, I think you probably agree, Suzanne and Sally, it's a bit of a breakthrough, you know. And I say, hurrah, let's go with it.
Can I come in there, Gary?
Yeah, of course.
What I think this conversation illustrates, and we've only had an hour and we're about shortly to come to a close, and people will have lots of feelings and thoughts today for who are here, and then the people who see this on the internet later. There will be all sorts of gaps that we didn't get to talk about that people might have feelings about. So I think at some point the word maternal deprivation came up this morning. That's a word from attachment, and people can get defensive about, are you saying that it's all about mothers? And there has been a feminist response to ACEs, to attachment, which produced a big debate appropriately.
Yeah.
Meaning that we need to have debate around any of these ideas. But we also need to be curious, because there are lots of key points in a theory that get lost when you take it out to the public. And then when that turns into arguments, it can shut curiosity down. And we miss really important points. We miss the history gets lost. So here's an important point that Robert Anda has been making recently. A lot of us have talked about what Simon just said, a score of 4 or more. And it is absolutely true that a score of 4 or more increases the likelihood of difficult outcomes in your adulthood. But he recently gave a talk, and I've put that link on Twitter, and I'm happy to do it again, in which he said, although it's accurate, it's a bit limited. It turns out that the reason 4 or more got into the public is because they needed to shorten their tables, because the journals that they were publishing in wouldn't let them put all their data out. Okay, what I'm trying to give is an example of the way in which scientists do their best to discover links and to create theory around that. And then when you reach the public with that, there are all sorts of things that we might have missed, not understood, not had a chance to talk about, got involved in debate. The more curious we can stay, the more able we are to prevent childhood suffering and to help people to recover from childhood suffering. And for me, I keep that at the center of everything I'm thinking about. We are talking about childhood suffering, and the more curiosity we can bring to that, the better chance we'll have of preventing it and of healing from it. And I hope we can keep that at the center of our thinking, even in the wider debates.
Well, I think, Suzanne, you are providing a platform for curiosity. And thank you very much for inviting me on as a survivor, really, because I don't often get the chance to make a contribution. You know, I mean, I think this is great.
Okay, I have, as we're just looking at the countdown on the clock here, two very quick questions, if I may. Sally, you said something really interesting earlier in the conversation, that it may be argued that actually, in terms of progression, we're on track. How will we know when we're there?
Oh.
Do you want another hour?
Well, let's be clear, I'm not a soothsayer. I think we're on a journey without being too simplistic. It's an ongoing journey, and there are way markers along the way, aren't there? I think the fact we're having the debate is a way marker. I think the fact we've got the NES trauma framework in Scotland is massive. None of this is perfect, you know, that there is always a tension between intent and outcome, and what drives that intent. I think in the 3 years I've been involved in these discussions in Scotland, we've come a long, long way. But
Scotland is the pioneer.
You're
giving us encouragement for London.
Well, I think, it's a journey. It's a bit. Sorry, Gary. I don't have an easy answer for that. I think there are way markers along the way. I think we're keeping the conversations going. I think for me the main bit and the most interesting bit for me when we're thinking about attachment is this notion of safety. If I didn't feel safe at a very fundamental level, separate to intent from my parents when I was little and growing up, that shapes me. That means I'm probably predisposed to anxiety, probably means I'm going to have some gaps along the way. And what strikes me is that safety is a fundamental underpinning tenet of trauma-informed approaches. So if we can have a conversation about how we create safety, how we do no harm, how we settle people, how we take people to a place of being able to hold complexity in life without feeling as if it's compromising or diminishing them, then we're getting closer to something bigger that's getting more people into their thinking brain rather than being stuck in fright mode.
Well, I loved your answer, and I loved I took some comfort from that, from just the phrase "on track." So thank you for that, Sally.
Thank you.
Simon, you've given an awful lot. You've been very generous with your time this morning. You know, I don't want to ask too. I mean, every question we tend to ask around this can be massive, but ideally, you know, what does success look like for you, from your point of view?
Well, I think I can sum it up quite simply in some ways, Gary. I would love to live in a society which had enough about safety, to use Sally's word, not to send kids off to boarding school or into care below the age of about 13 or 14, you know. I mean, I think some of this does have to become part of the common sense of our culture, using common sense in the best sense. And I think we're going there in some ways. We're living in this very kind of contradictory world. Some things seem to be going totally in the wrong direction, and others are going in the right direction. And there's this curious irony, I think, of COVID, where we've been forced to be socially distant. In some ways, it's reminded all of us of how important our interconnections are. And I think we are slowly making some progress. And at some point, you know, one reaches a critical mass. It's like, I mean, one of the analogies I have is we used to send kids into spinning mills and up chimneys and down mines, you know, as if it was something quite normal. We'd be horrified today at that suggestion. Well, I'm hoping in my lifetime, and I'm 73, people will say, "My goodness, you sent children of 6 and 7 off to boarding school. What on earth was that all about? You know, you must. That's not no way to nurture a child."
It's been a wonderful discussion. Suzanne, last word to you.
I would much rather that we are debating childhood suffering than that it was quiet. So I love all of these conversations, and if they are adding to wider cultural engagement with really tricky issues, I celebrate the courage of every single person who's part of this conversation. And Gary, I'm so grateful to you. You give your time to help make this a public conversation through Tigers and Teddies. And I'm really grateful to you for being here every single episode.
Well, I very much appreciate it. I meet wonderful people with wonderful stories, and that's the journalist in me, and I love it. Just got a little note through there that dawn is breaking in Canada, I think. So, hi, morning, Canada. Thank you for being with us throughout the night. More importantly, thank you, Sally.
I say hello to my friend Mary in the States and Florida as well, who I think got up early to watch.
Oh, fantastic. Absolutely, yes. Sorry, what's the lady's name?
Mary.
Hello, Mary in Florida. And Suzanne, next week we're back with something very special. We'll be looking at connection in care homes and talking to two sisters with a very, what I believe is going to be an emotional story. And Suzanne will be joined by Dr. Maggie Ellis as well.
Yes, we will. I think it's really exciting to talk about care homes because of all the groups that I am asked to come and speak to about connection, I'm never asked to come and speak to care homes. And yet we have a very clear sense in COVID about what happens in the home. Disconnection, and you can't be with your loved ones. And so I'm really glad that we have folks who next week are going to help us to bring that to this wider agenda about connection. Everything's amazing.
So to everybody who's viewing at home and around the world, remember two things. National Album Day. What I tend to find that helps my mental health is putting on my favorite playlist and my favorite music. We recommend that you do exactly the same. And please stay safe and look after yourself as we go through World Mental Health Day as well. Our thoughts are with you all. See you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.